I'm going to round out the October sky section of your notes. Just have this one little area left, and then we'll move on to Boldly Go. This is the patch for the ABMA, or the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. It's a facility where von Braun worked, and this is also the place where a lot of the early rocket launches occurred for the United States, and also where a lot of the early non-human animals were trained and launched. And you have to remember the time period that we're dealing with of the late 50s, early 60s, as mentioned before with Laika, the first mammal in space. We had very different ways of using animals in scientific experiments, aviation, space exploration than procedures and things that would certainly happen today in a 21st century mindset. And unfortunately, this comic depicts that quite well and poignantly. Hey, wait a second, you guys forgot to teach me how to get back to Earth, guys. And there were certainly an enormous amount of animals that the Soviet space program and NASA ran tests on to see if life can sustain being in a spacecraft and traveling at the high rate of speeds to get off the Earth and into orbit. And could you survive in your spacecraft in a space environment? And so animals, rats, mice, squirrels, flies, insects, all kinds of animals were sent for several years getting information, both sending into orbit and suborbital, so not quite getting into the bounds of space. We're going to take a more positive look here at the achievements of some of the non-human animals, where we did actually train some animals to return safely to Earth, specifically starting with the combo pair of Abel and Baker. Abel on the left there, a rhesus monkey, and Baker, who went on later to be more affectionately referred to as Miss Baker. She's a squirrel monkey. So you want to jot down Abel and Baker in your notebooks by the Army Ballistic Missile patch. You don't need to have the date for Abel and Baker, but just let you know where we are in the timeline of May of 1959. And this is the infamous moment here where they have successfully returned. Here is Abel and Miss Baker sitting up top of the life ring there. Sure, they got to be thinking, what was that field trip about? In the Smithsonian in D.C., Air and Space Museum, there's a mock-up of the top portion of the craft that took Baker and Abel into space. When I was a kid, I knew very early on that what I wanted to do with my life was be an astronaut. And more specifically, I wanted to be the first woman to walk on the moon. And every choice I made in life was pretty much associated with, is this going to help me get to be the first woman to take steps on the moon? And one of the things I definitely wanted to do as a kid was go to space camp. I grew up in the United Kingdom, and space camp was in the United States. The first original space camp was in Huntsville, Alabama, and it was so successful they expanded, and they now have space camps in Florida. But when I was a kid, that was my goal. I wanted to go to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama. It's, of course, very expensive, the flight, and sadly, the space camp adventure itself is pretty pricey. And my family definitely wasn't poor by any means, but setting aside a couple $1,000s to send one of the kiddos off to the United States for a little week of adventure was a little bit out of the picture. So I was pretty excited when Bubblicious came along. It's a gum factory company that's out of business now, I think, despite the number of packs of Bubblicious I bought in the 80s. But I bought all the Bubblicious packs that I could possibly afford with my monies, because they were offering Win a Space Adventure, blast off to space camp. I bought all the Bubblicious packs I possibly could, as I said. Did I win my space trip, or my space camp trip? I did not. But what I did win was a couple of root canals for all the bubblegum I chewed in my youth as an adult, so life lesson there. Brush your teeth more often. Alright, so there was a movie in the 80s release called Space Camp, and I was very jealous of the kids that went to Space Camp in this, of course, film. They weren't really at Space Camp. And crazy plot is that they went to Space Camp for some reason, not in a simulator, but in the actual Space Shuttle orbiter here. They're in there practicing, and lo and behold, the ignition occurs, lights the motors and the solid rocket boosters, and they blast into space. So I had thought to myself, hey, if I make it to space camp, maybe I can launch to space. Why not? I haven't seen or watched Space Camp since I was a kid. I have a bad feeling that if I were to watch it now, I'd probably be appalled at how atrocious the movie is. So I just leave it be a little tender memory from my youth of enjoying the film Space Camp. Hey, I didn't make it to Space Camp, but that's alright because a few years back I stumbled upon this thing called Space Academy, where Space Academy is for teachers. Okay, let's be honest, it's really Space Camp for adults. It's pretty awesome. It's a bunch of us attending under the premise that we're going to learn a lot to share with our students as we return to the classroom, but really it's all of us living out our childhood dreams that didn't come to fruition at the time. While I was at Space Academy, wait for it, while I was at Space Academy, I learned that there is Advanced Space Academy. Yeah, this is a 1 week stay. This is a 2 week stay. I have not yet gone to Advanced Space Academy, but I shall be going to Advanced Space Academy one day. So, hey, this dream didn't come true, but this one did open the door to even more dreams. While I was at Space Academy in Huntsville, Alabama, we were taking a tour of the U.S. Space and Rocket Center and the little museum that's within the Alabama Space Camp facility. And we're coming around the corner of a hallway. This happens to be the hallway that's got all the pictures of the greats in rocket science like Obert Tsiolkovsky. And our camp counselor stops right here and points out that this is the nose cone that took Able and Baker up into space. He talked about how they were monkeys, and there's a group of teachers around there. I'm in the back, so I like to take a little bit longer look at some of the things they have on display there. And one of the teachers asked there, now you have to remember, these are actually mostly middle school teachers, a couple of high school teachers, but they're not as obsessed with space exploration as, say, your instructor might be. And their head probably isn't as filled with as much NASA history, space exploration history as is probably socially acceptable. So one of the teachers asked the counselor there if Able and Baker returned from space safely. And the counselor got a little quiet, a little sobering moment, and he says, no, unfortunately, like many of the animals in the early space program days, didn't survive. So I'm in the back, and I'm thinking, oh, that's not right. The big deal about Able and Baker was that they did come back safely, and a big victory for the United States. So I'm sitting in the back, realizing that counselors said something inaccurate, and the educator side of me is thinking, ooh, I gotta make sure the people in the group here don't go back if they talk about this with their own students, give wrong information to students. Not that I don't, but, if I can try and stop it, I do, or avoid it. But then there's that other part of me saying, oh, this is the first day. You've only been with your group for a couple hours. You don't want to become that student right from the get-go of, oh, here's the nerdy nerd in the pack. Not that I'm shy about being nerd. Nerds are awesome. Nerds rule. But in a new social setting, I kind of wanted to play it cool and calm. So I compromised. I just leaned over to Eddie, and I was like, Eddie, that's not actually true. Able and Baker came back alive. And I thought, hey, he could point it out to the group. He's, a taller individual, stood out a little bit more. And what Eddie decided to do, rather, was say, hey, Smith over here says Able and Baker came back alive. So from that moment on, for the rest of the week, in my group, which quite coincidentally, some might say ironically, my group had been assigned the team name of Integrity. So the rest of the week, Team Integrity members would always look to me and say, are they right? Is that right? Is that right? Is that what they said? Is that true? Good times. But a little frustrating because at the end of the tour at the Space Camp facility, you walk out of the main doors and there's a sign. Oh yeah, it's hidden amongst the foliage here. But there's a sign pointing the way to Miss Baker's memorial. And if you walk over there, and I would think a counselor does the tours regularly, would probably have noticed this sign. Miss Baker, squirrel monkey, born and died, first U.S. animal to fly in space and return alive. Well, anyhow, so I'll zoom in a little bit better, make it more clearly. First U.S. animal to fly in space and return alive, May of 1959. For a lot of people, you'll look at this marker because it's standing high out of the ground and just walk away. But if you happen to get close enough and you just cast your eyes a little bit down here, you'll see this plaque, this headstone rather, of Big George, husband of Miss Baker. You gotta love it. Gotta love it. So here's a little clip of the story of Able and Baker.
The Cold War was raging. The dynamic duo of nuclear nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, engaged in the ultimate Cold War contest,
30 seconds.
the space race. Into the fray came a couple of unlikely heroes, Able and Baker, space monkeys to the rescue. On October 4th, 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik 1, the first satellite to orbit the Earth. The enemy had made it to space. It was time for the U.S. to catch up. In July of 1958, Congress formed the National Aeronautic and Space Administration to make the atomic age space race a little more civil and less military. A few months later, the agency launched Project Noah's Ark, the first small step in the Mercury astronaut program. That's where Able and Baker come in. They were in line to take the United States where no man or monkey had gone before, to space and back. They were part of a team of monkeys training rigorously for just such a mission. Able and the other rhesus monkeys with the Army at Walter Reed near Washington. Baker and the squirrel monkeys with the Navy in Pensacola, Florida.
The monkeys went through their own astronaut training, flight simulations, weightlessness, IQ tests. For several months, they were subjected to a multitude of tests to see which ones had the right stuff.
Scientists kept meticulous performance records for all the monkeys. 3 days before the mission, 2 monkeys were chosen for duty. 2 female monkeys. It would be Able and Baker, the best and the brightest, at least at sitting still. At military research centers, some of the best scientists in America had been hard at work building the capsules for the monkeys' trip. Able's capsule was 41 inches long, with controlled air, temperature, and pressure, all of life's necessities, minus the bananas. On this short 15-minute flight, there would be no need for food or beverage. Able was held in place by what engineers called a specially contoured couch made of fiberglass with half-inch thick polyurethane foam padding. Baker had her own tiny capsule, complete with her own tiny couch. It too came ready with life support systems and biological instruments. Both capsules were wrapped in a space-age material, aluminum foil, and placed in the nose cone of a single Army-built Jupiter ballistic missile. The world watched as NASA prepared to send its animal envoys into outer space.
Both Able and Baker were fed raw peanuts just before takeoff to induce constipation, but just in case, they were wearing charcoal-lined diapers.
On May 28, 1959, at 2:35 a.m., the missile lifted from the pad at Cape Canaveral, climbed through a thin layer of clouds, and roared toward space. During their short trip, 300 miles over the Atlantic, Able and Baker were weightless for 9 minutes. The only thing left to do was to make it back, alive.
These things really slammed down back into the atmosphere. They really came down with enormous acceleration, some 30 to 40 times the pull of gravity, which is more than any astronaut ever could be subjected to.
In less than 15 minutes, the 1,500-mile journey was over. Able and Baker splashed down in choppy seas 40 miles north of Antigua. The capsule was pulled aboard the USS Kiowa and opened. The Space Monkeys had made it, alive and well. On board, Able and Baker got the first-class treatment as they steamed toward Puerto Rico. There, they hopped a plane to Washington. During the flight, Baker took the time to scan newspaper stories of her now celebrated exploits. When they arrived, the world-famous monkeys received a hero's welcome. But 3 days after the flight, during a routine minor operation to remove a heart-monitoring electrode, events took a tragic turn for Able.
The doctors gave Able an anesthetic to alleviate the discomfort. Sadly, she had an adverse reaction to it. Moments later, she stopped breathing and died.
With Able gone, Baker basked in the glory for a little while longer. In July of 1959, she was awarded a medal for her contribution to humanity. Baker quietly spent the rest of her life in a special habitat at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. The public inevitably lost interest in Able and Baker as human astronauts replaced them. But on that special day in May of '59, 2 monkeys became the first primates, the first Americans, and the first females to make a round trip to space. They helped make the United States #1 in the space race. Baker was 27 years old, 3 times her life expectancy, when she died on November 29, 1984. She's buried near the entrance to the Rocket Center under a 5-foot granite memorial marking her place in history. In honor of her sacrifice, the government had Able stuffed for posterity, and she has taken her rightful place among her space-age peers. Able the Space Monkey is on exhibit in the Apollo to the Moon Gallery at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington.
Yeah, so the first time I went to the Smithsonian as a little kid, I think I was about 7.5, and I had seen that display of Able and the mock-up of the spacecraft, and I completely thought that the animal was a stuffed toy animal. I did not know till the very first time I watched this clip that it was Able. So I've actually seen Able. I'd prefer to have not said that I've actually seen Able, but nonetheless. So, great victory. We have ourselves on page 2. The items listed on pages 2 and 3, they do go in chronological order. I just didn't pause and put this in here for you. We will come back to this. So we're on this row here, row 6, plants and animals returned alive. We're going to put a check mark here. Soviet Union. If you were paying ever so close attention, the clip and myself have referred to Able and Baker as the first U.S. animals to return from space safely. The first animals into space, but not orbit, but they did pass into the bounds of space, are Tiskin and Dzik of July 1951 fame. So 2 dogs there. And then the first animals to actually orbit the planet and return safely are Belka and Strelka. Here's an image from space of Strelka during the flight. And they are highly, highly revered dogs in the Soviet Union, now Russia, culture. The film of Space Dogs, of course, first put out in the Russian language, and then an English version was released. Belka is on display in a museum in Russia, and that is Belka. I'm not sure why we do that. That is Belka. And Google Doodle, that was released in the Russian Federation in 2010, representing the anniversary of their space flight. You may not realize that the Google Doodles aren't always shown worldwide. On August 2010, this probably wasn't the Google Doodle in the United States. But there is a lot of high regard, as I've said several times, for the Soviet space dogs. A little poster here. But it wasn't just dogs that the Soviets sent into space. Rabbits, cats, mice, just like the U.S. sent a variety of animals. So up to item 5, the row we temporarily skipped here. First photos of another world from space. Let's just look at that image here. This is the backside of Earth's moon. This image was taken 4th of October 1957 by the Luna 3 spacecraft. Luna 3. I think that sounds like a Soviet ship or a U.S. ship. 4th of October 1957, exactly 2 years from Sputnik 1. We are putting the check mark here for the Soviets. All right, how about item 7, Hominidae. This is the first hominid, if you want to think of it. This is from the great ape family. And anytime I say great ape, I have to mentally make sure I don't actually say the great grape ape. That's a little cartoon I used to watch when I was a kid on Saturday mornings. I'd watch this cartoon with great interest, as I never quite figured how the great grape ape could sit on top of this van without crushing the van. However, I've just now realized that as a child it never concerned me that the dog was driving the van. But anytime I have to mention hominidae, I worry I'm going to say great grape ape. So I just put it out there now for you. And since the little jingle's going through to my head for the great grape ape, I got to share that with you and get it in your head as well. Fantastic. So the check mark for the first hominidae is going to go for the United States, as we have the first chimpanzee in space, who was named after the facility that he trained at in New Mexico, the Holloman Aerospace Medical Center. So the first chimp in space was called Ham. In January of 1961, you just need to have the name Ham. And here is the ham of Ham the chimp. Here he is in a pre-flight activity. He loved being rewarded and training with the hopes of being rewarded with apples. Like any good space traveler, you want to check out your equipment before launch, make sure everything is in order. He gets suited up, put in his capsule, all sealed up, and he did become the first successful hominid to travel to space and back. Here he is on the Navy ship where he was recovered, and besides thinking, what have I just experienced, as he too experienced, like Abel and Baker, at least 10 times the amount of G-forces that human astronauts experience in space travel. He's thinking, I need lots of apples. Give me lots of apples. He was a feature on the cover of Life magazine, showing the space chimp lives, paves the way for flight by man. And he had a pretty good life in the spotlight for several years as a hero of the space program. And he was appropriately laid to rest in Alamogordo, New Mexico, which happens to be the site of the International Space Hall of Fame. And this is the headstone for Ham. A little bit of Ham's legacy lives on through this animated movie called Space Chimps. The main character is the great-grandson of Ham. This is his mentor who worked with the supposed original Ham within the context of the Space Chimp film. Space Chimps happened to be released the summer that I was at Space Academy, and we did share the facility with some of the young whippersnappers from Space Camp, elementary, middle school kids, and we would be released to go to lunch just a few minutes before the elementary students swarmed the cafeteria. And The banana company was, I think it was Dole that was running the ads for Space Chimps. They had these stickers on bananas that you could collect all the major characters. And of course the ham sticker was the most sought after of all. And I should probably be ashamed to admit that I did barrel over an elementary kid at one lunch to be sure that I got the banana that I could see had the ham sticker on there. It's not nice, I know. But hey, if that little kid had gotten the sticker, would they still have it? Yeah, probably. They're probably the first astronaut to walk on Mars. I know. Little scene here from the Space Chimp film, just laying out the reality that the only reason we're here is to see if we explode in space. So maybe not a movie just for kids here. I've not seen this, but there is Space Chimps 2. The storyline of Zartog Striking Back is Zartog is the superhero name for the child that was once clobbered over while they were a youth at space camp by some maniac grabbing a banana out of their hands. No, I don't know what Space Chimps 2 is about. And I didn't actually grab it out of the kid's hand. He probably was just reaching for it. But very similar timing as myself. Yep, moving along.